Hello, my lovelies. Welcome to another episode of our book review. I know last time that we were here, you had so much fun with Josephine when she took you through Ama from Poma by Bright Quickwakia. This week, we're going to be going outside of Ghana, specifically to Kenya. One of my favorite African authors, Ngugui. We're going to be discussing Weep Not Child. As usual, we're going to go through the setting of the story, plot summary, some of the characters in the story, literary devices, and themes that can be found in the story. So we're going to go straight to the setting of the story. Weep Not Child is set in a Ngugui village in Kenya between 1952 to 1960, an 8-year period where we see the Kenyan people struggling with the British people for their independence. Now, this was a very tumultuous, violent era in Kenya, and there was a lot of bloodshed on the part of the Africans or the Kenyans at that time. So this is a very significant story because much like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, this was the first novel coming out of Kenya during that period that was representing the African voice aside from the British one. So our story begins with Njoroge, our protagonist, being told by his mother that he's going to start attending school. Now, Njoroge is especially happy about this new development because he's always wanted to attend school. He's aware that going to school is going to strain the family finances, but it's something that he's very intent on committing to. When his father comes back and is told the news that his wife is going to let his son go to school, he's also very proud, knowing that his son is going to be the first person in their family to attend school. Now, Njoroge's father works for Jacobo. Jacobo is an African who deals with white settlers and through that has made a fortune for himself. One of those white settlers that Jacobo deals with is Mr. Howlands. Now, these people are very essential to the plot of the story. That's why I'm mentioning their names at this time. So please keep their names in mind so that you'll be able to connect the story when we go further. Now, Njoroge, our protagonist, lives in a polygamous home. His father has 2 wives and he has 2 brothers, Kamau and Boro, both of them his step-siblings. Now, Kamaru is just a few years older than Njoroge, but instead of attending school, he's apprenticed to become a carpenter. His brother Boro was forced to fight in the World War where he lost his brother and he suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm sure at that time nobody noticed that that's what he was suffering with because he didn't get the help that he required to get better. And we see that his issue or the problem that he suffers from is shown in his distrust for people in general and in the decisions that he'll take later on in his life. Both Njoroge and Kamau are happy with their prospects for the future. Njoroge is happy to attend school. Kamau is happy to be apprenticed to a carpenter because they both believe that these things are going to help them amass wealth for themselves in the future and be able to take better care of their family. The story continues and we realize that African workers in the story or Kenyan workers are unhappy with the treatment that they are getting from the British, from the Asians, as Indian traders that have settled in their country, in their villages, in their traditional ancestral homes. So these people decide to carry out a strike. Ngotho, who is Njoroge, our protagonist's father, doesn't want to partake in the strike because he's afraid of losing his job. But he attends a second strike meeting despite being told not to attend the meeting by his 2 wives. During the strike or during the meeting where African workers are deciding whether or not to carry out the strike, when or not the details involved in it, Jacobo, who I mentioned previously as an African Ngugui farmer who deals with settlers, tries to stop the strike or interrupt the meeting. Ngotho gets into an altercation with him and a riot starts. As the riot starts, 2 people are killed. Jacobo promises to exact revenge on Ngotho for the role that he played. Due to this, Ngotho is sacked or fired from his job as a farmer on Mr. Howland's farms. Now let's remember that Ngotho works for Jacobo, who works for Mr. Howland. So that is how come Ngotho is fired from his work as a farmer on Mr. Howland's farms. So because that happened, Ngotho has to move his entire family to another area, and Njoroge's brothers have to take over paying for his tuition because his father is no longer able to do so because he lost his job. Based on the events that have happened, Njoroge is forced to transfer schools. So he's separated from his childhood best friend, Emil Haki. I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing that wrong. But Emil Haki is the daughter of Jacobo, who now happens to be a sworn enemy of Njoroge's father. But Njoroge is somehow happy to have some distance between him and his friend because he's embarrassed of the actions that his father took against Emoaki's father. So he doesn't really mind having to transfer schools. And in any case, Emoaki goes to a girls' boarding school, so they can't even be in the same school to begin with. Whilst all of this is happening in his personal life, there's much that is going on a much larger scale at a national level. The Mau Mau uprising has started, and one of their biggest leaders, Jomo Kenyatta, is set to stand trial. He's viewed by most Kenyans at this point as their savior who is going to rescue them from the constraints of British rule. When he stands trial, he loses and he faces a jail term that could last any number of years. So then during the time, while so many things are happening in Njoroge's family, whilst they are undergoing their own turmoil as a family, as changes are happening in their family, the nation, the country Kenya, is going through its own changes, its own turmoil, and it seems as though it is replicated. The turmoil that is happening at the national level is replicated at the local, smaller level in households. Njoroge's family has been thrown into complete turmoil. His father is dead, his brother Kamau has been imprisoned, and his brother Bo is on the run as a fugitive from the law. As all of this happened, he has to relinquish his education and come back home to take care of his two mothers. At this point, it's almost as though all his dreams are dead and darkness has settled on his life. But the one shining beacon of hope in his life is in Milwaukee, who he loves. He goes to see her and professes his love for her. But somehow, she admits that even though she loves him too, they cannot be together. Her father is dead, his father is dead, they were sworn enemies, and she's compelled to stay in Kenya to take care of her mother. He also has to do the same and take care of his two mothers. When this happens, he falls into complete despair and tries to commit suicide. But his two mothers find him and convince him not to take his life. He comes back, but the bright, happy boy who had so many expectations and hope for the future is no more there. Njoroge has grown up into a man that is bitter, full of hopelessness and shame about what his life turned out to be. Despite the success that Njoroge is experiencing in his personal life, the Mau Mau and their effects is not detached from him. He becomes an unwilling victim of the suppression and intimidation that British forces put on Africans suspected to be part of the organization when Jacobo is found murdered. Mr. Howland's Ngotho is dragged out of school one day and he finds out that he and his father have both been summoned. They are almost beaten to death on account or on suspicion that they are responsible for the murder of Jacobo. Very soon the reader discovers that both of them had nothing to do with the murder of Jacobo, and rather Kamau and Boro, Njoroge's brothers, are responsible for his murder. Kamau is arrested and imprisoned, and Boro, they find out, is a leader of the Mau Mau organization, but somehow he manages to escape. And then you find out too that Njoroge's father was aware of the role that his sons played in the murder of Jacobo, but does not out them to the authorities. Later on, he dies from his injuries, and what makes it sadder is that despite knowing that his sons were responsible for this, and despite the fact that they lost respect for their father after he lost his job, he does not give them up, and he ends up dying to protect them. Njoroge's family has been thrown into complete turmoil. His father is dead, his brother Kamau has been imprisoned, and his brother Bo is on the run as a fugitive from the law. As all of this happened, he has to relinquish his education and come back home to take care of his two mothers. At this point, it's almost as though all his dreams are dead and darkness has settled on his life. But the one shining beacon of hope in his life is in Milwaukee, who he loves. He goes to see her and professes his love for her. But somehow, she admits that even though she loves him too, they cannot be together. Her father is dead, his father is dead, they were sworn enemies, and she's compelled to stay in Kenya to take care of her mother. He also has to do the same and take care of his two mothers. When this happens, he falls into complete despair and tries to commit suicide. But his two mothers find him and convince him not to take his life. He comes back, but the bright, happy boy who had so many expectations and hope for the future is no more there. Ngugui has grown up into a man that is bitter, full of hopelessness and shame about what his life turned out to be. So, some of the themes that we see running through Weep Not Child are grief. Grief is one of the major themes that runs through it. Social class is another, land ownership, love, infighting, women's role in society, and family loyalty. So I'm going to start from grief. We see that a lot of the story in Weep Not Child is propelled by grief. For example, Bo is never able to come to terms with living his life after he witnesses his brother Mwangi's death during the World War. This forces him to join the Mau Mau. Ngugui becomes a devout Christian that has so much faith and belief in God, and nothing can change his mind. But once his father dies and grief hits him, he stops praying. Ngugui is very, very much in love with Ngugui, but she cannot leave her grieving mother and run away with him to go and live in Uganda as they had planned. And this also shows in Ngotho's relationship with Mr. Howland and with Mr. Jacobo. His resentment towards these two people are fueled by the grief of losing his family land to them in a way that he felt was unfair. So we see that most of the characters in this story have their lives, their destinies, or the development of their characters stemming from grief that they experienced at one point or the other. So we're going to go through some important quotes that were used in the book that helps us better understand the story. I'll explain some of these quotes, make an analysis of them, then we come to an end of today's episode. So the first quote that I'm going to take is from page 102, and it was said by Ngugui, Ngugi's love. So she says, I was thinking that if Jesus really knew about this thing in our country, he could have stopped it. Now, she was referring to the state that Kenya and Kenyans were in at the time that they were having this discussion. She was having this discussion with Ngugui. Much like Ngugui, she was also a devout Christian, believed in God, had so much faith, read her Bible, respected her religion, and did what she was supposed to do. But at a point, just like Ngugui got to a point where he stopped being a religious person, and some would say believing in God, she got to that point where she didn't believe in God as well, because it was difficult for them or for her to connect the God that is full of love and kindness and mercy, compassion, to watch people, an entire country, go through what Kenyans were going at the time. In between the period of the Mau Mau uprising, and between 1952 to 1960, over 12,000 to 20,000 Kenyans were killed in their bid to attain independence. So living in this period where you're seeing so much bloodshed and everything going on, it makes you question whether there's a God. It falls very much in line with one of the most popular sayings of Jomo Kenyatta, who at that time, who plays quite a role in the story at this time. If you've read this quote somewhere, you'd see that he said that when we closed our eyes, they gave us the Bible and taught us how to pray. When we opened our eyes, we had the Bible and they had our land. So something along those lines, believing in the God that your oppressors brought to you, is that God really real? And if you look at it, Ngugui is less of a character and more of a symbol. She's something that Ngugui, the author, uses as a sort of symbolism in the novel. She represents purity, love, and all good things that we see in the novel. But we realize that at a certain point, she begins to get a sort of political consciousness of her own, and she discusses these things with Njoroge, and to a large extent we see how this is played out in the novel. Land ownership is another key theme that runs through the story. As you read the story, you realize that the Kenyan people, the Ngugui people, have a deeply spiritual connection to the land. And you realize that it's shown in the way that Ngotho is dedicated to taking care of Mr. Howland's lands. Despite the fact that the land now belongs to Mr. Howland, he still sees the land as his land, his ancestral land, and so he cares for the land as though it's his. Mr. Howland, in one way or the other, seems to have embodied this type of relationship or sentiment towards land despite being racist. So he also feels that type of connection to the land. And at a point in the story, you realize that land transcends its basic meaning and takes on a multi-dimensional definition. For example, after Njoroge passes his examination, the entire village bands together to pay for his tuition. And you see that in the novel, there's a line. They say that Njoroge is no longer son of Ngotho, but rather a son of the land. It goes to show you just how much land is valued, and land ownership plays a key role in what will lead to the struggle and the fight for independence by the Kenyans against the British rule. So the last quote that we are going to look at is actually on page 20, and it's said by the narrator. It goes, "Any man who has land was considered rich. If a man had plenty of money, many motor cars, but no land, he could never be counted as rich. A man who went with tattered clothes but had at least an acre of red earth was better off than the man with money." You see, when we were speaking earlier on about some of the themes that ran through the story, we said land ownership was one that was really strong, and it is emphasized in this quote by the narrator. The Ngugui had a strong attachment to their land. Land was considered the most important thing in their lives, in their communities. That is why Njoroge's father harbored so much resentment towards Jacobo and Mr. Howland, because they had come in, people that didn't have any rights to his ancestral land, had claimed rights to it and had made him a squatter on that land. So you realize that this resentment that he kept inside him developed into so many things that later on led to him losing his life. Even Njoroge, despite viewing education as the most important thing, when it came down to it, wanted to be educated to make money so that he could buy land for his family. Because when it comes down to it, nothing was more important to these people than their land. That is why the struggle for independence had such a personal feeling for the Ngugui people, because they were not just fighting for their freedom, they were fighting for their land, which embodies them as a people, as a culture. It was their sense of identification and pride, and having this stolen or taken from them, there was no way that they could stand back and watch. So this is one of the main reasons that led to the uprising, that's empowered the Mau Maus, that's allowed people to hide them, to provide for them, to support them, and in the end to fight and win their independence. So this brings us to the end of this book review. I hope that you had an amazing time. I know that this one was much longer than the others, but remember that we are just whiling away time. And like I've said before, if you have questions, suggestions, inputs, please don't forget to leave them in the comment section down below, and we'll see you next week. Have an amazing time. Bye.